Today's episode is brought to you by Marvin Planning Consultants. Marvin Planning Consultants works with communities of all sizes as well as county governments throughout Nebraska and the Midwest. Located in David City, we are a full-service planning firm working on comprehensive plans, zoning, housing, blighted and substandard studies, annexations, and other facets of community and county planning. Hello and welcome to the Booked on Planning podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Rouse, transportation planner with the Lincoln Lancaster County Planning Department, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Cale Broderson, assistant planner with the City of La Vista. We're here to get you hooked on planning through the books that have shaped the field. Let's dive in. Rachel Carson became a guiding spirit of the modern environmental movement with her groundbreaking 1962 bestseller, Silent Spring. It forced us to reconsider our fundamental faith in science and technology. Carson spent over 6 years documenting the effects of DDT, a synthetic organic compound used as an insecticide, on numerous communities. Her analysis revealed that such powerful, persistent chemical pesticides have been used without full understanding of the extent of their potential harm, not just on wildlife, birds, bees, and animals, but to humans as well. In Silent Spring, Carson discussed her findings with plenty of examples and cases and makes a passionate plea for the future of the planet, calling on us to act as stewards of the environment. The book begins by highlighting Carson's moral obligation to write the book because no magazine would publish her work regarding the harmful effects of pesticide control. She even came under fire as the book was being published, with big companies trying to discredit her or stop the book from being published. I would say this shows how important the book was going to become.
Yes, Rachel Carson was primarily a marine biologist by trade, actually, and she had started to see some of the negative impacts of the use of these chemicals. And so she was very concerned about the growing use. And she had approached some magazines about publishing an article that she wrote, as you had mentioned. But these magazines, the way that they make their money is through advertising dollars. And some of their large clients that would purchase ads were the companies selling these chemicals. So the magazines wouldn't touch her with the 10-foot pole. And she tried to find someone else to write this book, but when she couldn't find anyone to do that, she took it upon herself. And I know she was struggling with her health at the time. It was at the end of her career. I know she was battling cancer the entire time she was writing the book, and she actually passed away 2 years later. But she was heavily criticized once this was published. She was called a communist attempting to destabilize the West and their food security. You got to remember this was during the Cold War. And a former Secretary of Agriculture publicly ridiculed Carson, asking why a spinster with no children was so concerned with genetics. So it did get pretty ugly, a little smear campaign, but her message still got through. And the reason why this book is still referenced in planning schools and why we're talking about it now is so that we keep environmental sustainability on the top of our minds. So as we're designing communities and we're considering how they'll incorporate and impact the natural environment, we're doing it the right way and the safe way. It was definitely a heavy environmental science and studies book. As you're reading it, your gut reaction is, wait, how does this still apply to planners today? But while most planners aren't engaged in the use of chemicals or maybe the maintenance of our right-of-ways or green spaces, we do still make decisions that impact nature and the health of our citizens.
Yeah, I think you're right that in most cases in our day-to-day work, it just seems very removed from environmental impacts, especially if you're a development review planner reviewing projects and kind of pushing them through the approval process. But even in those roles, I think that we need to be aware of and be ready to defend recommendations that we're making as it relates to environmental impacts, as some developments do trigger environmental regulations, or in some cases, they even stir the attention of environmental groups. Here in Lincoln, we actually have a development proposal right now that's receiving a lot of attention because it's adjacent to the boundary of one of our large natural parks. There are most likely experts from your parks department or your stormwater engineering departments, et cetera, that can probably answer a lot of these really detailed questions that come up in these meetings. But as planners, I think it's our responsibility to, as the managers of these applications and shepherding it through the process, to have a good understanding of where the environmental movement began and why it's important. And I think you do get that from this book, even though it's very grounded in kind of the chemical application, but that's kind of where the environmental movement began. One thing I noticed pretty quickly about the book is the emphasis on data Clearly, you can see Carson's background in ecology, as you had mentioned before, and it's sometimes hard to follow when there's a stream of terms and chemicals get thrown out there like DDT, dieldrin, aldrin, heptachlor. In chapter 3, she goes into the science behind a lot of the man-made chemicals and their harmful effects on humans and wildlife. DDT is one of the main culprits, which under very small doses is often ingested without us knowing through milk, eggs, or even fruits and vegetables, and can add up over time to be quite harmful, as she points out. In 1972, 10 years after Silent Spring was published, DDT was finally banned, but its harmful chemicals persisted for a long time afterwards in the environment and animal tissues.
Yeah, it was easy to get lost in the scientific terminology, but without trying to memorize and keep all the names of the different chemicals straight, the ones that she was focusing on were these called the chlorinated hydrocarbons. So these are these compounds that we now know are closely linked with immune system suppression and cancer causing agents in humans and other animals. And that was one of the big concerns is these compounds can take a really long time to break down. So DDT, for example, it has a half-life in soils of between 2 and 15 years, depending on conditions, how deep and how much sunlight exposure, those things. So in the worst scenarios, those worst cases, after 15 years, half of that compound is still present. And that's just from a single application, where a lot of the places where DDT was being used, it was not being used just one time. You had to use it again and again and again, and then use more harmful chemicals. So eventually you're building up these extreme concentration of these poisons, and that was very concerning.
And Carson did a great job in her book of pointing out this impact. And in doing some of the research for this episode, I found an article and a short film by the New York Times that discussed some of the criticisms of Rachel Carson. As you mentioned earlier, she came under quite a bit of fire after publishing this book. And I had no idea there was such a debate, even in recent years, critics going so far as to call her a mass murderer for her contribution to the ban on DDT in the US. She actually never called for an outright ban on DDT, but instead focused broadly on the fact that any pesticide use would create insect resistance to pesticides, making them useless in eliminating the target insect populations. In 2017, the video dove into the debate on whether Carson's work that led to the ban on DDT was negative because of malaria outbreaks in Africa and Asia, where the EPA ban did not have any authority. She was actually right about the chemicals. In areas where DDT was still being used, the mosquitoes carrying the disease had become pretty resistant to the chemical. And she talks pretty extensively in the book about how our man-made solutions are temporary and that insects that we try to kill with chemicals were never actually eradicated. We need to have holistic views of pest control with more specific and controlled measures.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. She has some great examples and case studies for procedures that were going on at the same time as these chemicals are being used, or these approaches that were way more effective, far less harmful, they were cheaper, and they ended with faster longing in solutions and results. So some of those examples are, if you have a pest, try introducing a natural predator. So a lot of these pests would come from other countries, and so some communities would try and find the natural predator of that pest in the other country and introduce that to control for it. Now, obviously, that needs to be done carefully as well. Just like we're using chemicals, we need to think through all the implications of introducing another pest. But in general, that's how nature has found the way to control and keep balance. So it's generally a better solution if it works. Aside from that, if we have to use chemicals, spraying should be targeted. So in this book, there were, so many examples where communities would just go and spray over entire neighborhoods and communities and counties. These huge amounts of chemicals, where there were studies at the time of applications where if you go through with individuals, with people with backpacks that are going and spraying individual plants, not everything, you're using significantly less material, obviously. And so that ended up making it a lot cheaper. Aside from the use of chemicals, as we're implementing and maintaining our natural spaces in our communities, we should be planning for species diversity as a way to prevent pests. So she talked about, and this is very well known nowadays with planners and parks planners, that when we came to the United States and started building cities and we're colonizing, we like to use the exact same species of tree for every tree in our city. Either we liked the way it looked, or we liked how it grew fast, or it was just cheaper to plant the same kind of tree. But what we were doing is making our urban forests really vulnerable and also establishing large amounts of food and fuel for these pest populations to explode. So in nature, where you have a forest where any individual tree species, they might be located further apart. And so a pest that's preying on that, whether it be pine beetle or emerald ash borer or a pest for white elms, they spend more time transitioning from food source to food source. So there's less energy devoted into laying more eggs, and a smaller amount of the population survives in that transition. But in our urban forests, where all the trees are the same, a lot more time can be devoted to laying eggs, and more of them will survive as they go to the next food source because it's closer. So we're creating these problems for ourselves, and luckily we're doing a much better job of planting urban forests with species diversity.
I think that's another great example of where, as planners, we see that connection to the environmental movement in our day-to-day work with boulevard tree requirements. And almost every community now has canopy tree requirements that you can't have the same species next to one another, or they go so far as to identify these are the exact locations of these trees. We're not going to plant anything else to make sure that we have a good variety, so we don't end up with a situation we're in now with a whole bunch of treeless corridors because all the elms are gone or all the ashes are gone.
Exactly.
And one of the points Carson makes that seems really obvious today, but wasn't back then, is the fact that we have to keep developing more harmful and toxic chemicals to fight the evolution of pests that we've created. The more we spray, the harder it is to kill the pests. As you mentioned, Carson points out a number of examples where managing pests with other natural systems or even insects is a better option. The concept relies on a functioning ecosystem where we do not need to introduce harmful chemicals, and instead we can allow natural systems to take care of the threat. Do you think we're doing more of this today, or are we leaning into chemicals still to solve the issue?
Yeah, I would say both. I mean, some of the chemicals are different, but I think ultimately we are still leaning into the use of chemicals pretty heavily. I found a report from the United States Department of Agriculture that tracks the use of chemicals, specifically in agriculture. And between 1960 and 1981, so essentially the 20 years following when this book was published, pesticide use in agriculture more than tripled, and herbicide use increased more than tenfold. So huge increase in the use of these chemicals for agriculture right after the book. Luckily, it peaked in around 1981 when we were using about 600 million pounds of active ingredient per year. Now, like today, we're using closer to 500 million pounds of active ingredient per year. So it's stabilized since then, but we are still relying on it pretty heavily. And that's just for agriculture. For household and consumer use of the chemicals, I mean, think of all the lawns that we have in the United States and buildings where we are still using chemicals in common practice. So now I don't think we're going over and spraying chemicals over entire communities like was happening in some incidences before this book was published. So we're being maybe less reckless at least. But I guess the short answer, I think Rachel Carson would still be a little unhappy maybe with where we're at, that we're not taking integrated pest management to the full extent that we should be. But on the bright side, that practice, integrated pest management, is becoming way more popular in cities around the United States and university systems, even these institutions that adopt policies, practices that are focused more on pest prevention. So if you can keep the pests from arriving in the first place, you don't have to spray chemicals to kill it. So that is a good thing. And I think it's becoming a lot more popular.
You can start to see some of that a little bit in programs like regenerative agriculture and these concepts or documentaries I've seen recently about creating whole ecosystems on a farmstead. There was a really fascinating one that I can link in the show notes that was on Netflix, I believe, about this couple that left the city, started a whole farm, and they were building off of this really depleted area. All the soils were trash because they just had one type of crop that was growing on it, and it really pulled all the nutrients out of it. And it took an immense amount of work, which is, I think, another reason why people would rather divert to just chemical sprays to fix the problem. But they ended up creating a really fascinating ecosystem on this farm that every problem was handled with another type of animal or solution. So it was very interesting. Since the book was published, a lot of important milestones have taken place. The Clean Air Act became law in 1963. In late 1969, President Richard Nixon signed the National Environmental Policy Act, regarded as the most important piece of national environmental legislation. That act forms the Council of Environmental Quality, coordinating federal efforts on environmental issues. In 1970, the first Earth Day with mass gatherings around the nation were held, and DDT, one of the most well-known harmful chemicals in Carson's book, was banned in the US in 1972. A little side note, as we're recording this today, it also happens to be Earth Day. Didn't plan this, but it worked out pretty well.
Happy Earth Day.
Yeah, I think it's the 52nd. Yeah, it'd be the 52nd Earth Day. The decision to ban DDT accumulated after 3 years of intense governmental inquiries into the use of DDT that convinced the government that the continued massive use of DDT posed unacceptable risks to the environment and potential harm to human health. I feel like Carson is often given the credit, or as previously noted, the blame for this ban, but I'm not so sure if it's fair to cite her as the person that led the ban or charge, or is the one that caused the legislation to move forward. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this was a very political decision, involved a lot of players and advocates, and it took a decade. But it is hard to deny that she contributed to the ban. I think her book was a catalyst, and it applied the pressure of public opinion and fear that gave the political will to do something about it. So once her book was published, I think it had a pretty fairly immediate effect on public sentiment. I know she appealed really strongly to the American population at the time. You had rapidly suburbanizing population, still a lot of women not in the workforce that were at home and responsible for maintaining the home. And there's a lot of fear with the Cold War happening, and this fear of chemicals that would get them and their families and their children sick, I think really resonated with people. And at the time, JFK was president, and someone had asked him a question about Rachel Carson's book in a press conference, and he had commented that there was some merit to the book. And so I think that helped a lot of people, because of his popularity, fight through the smear campaign that was going on against Rachel Carson and take her seriously.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that fact about the JFK press conference. That's interesting. It's also interesting to draw parallels to Carson's work on environmental issues that were taking place in the 60s to today with our focus on climate change. We seem to be having the same argument over the science that was had around the chemical used to tame insect populations. I can see similar trends in the advocacy efforts, where her book ignited an environmental activism in society that has carried through to today. Today's movement, however, has the benefit of social media and the internet to spread information, to fight for change, and to stem a lot of the issues that we're having with our environment. Do you think it makes it easier or more difficult than Carson's campaign, which was largely waged in print, whereas today there's almost too much information out there to digest?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think in the same way that social media helps ignite activism and make information more accessible to people, it also makes misinformation that much more accessible to people. And I think everyone would probably agree with this, either from one way or another, that we're having kind of a hard time siphoning through all that information and determining what is accurate and what is not. So there are very strong parallels, though, with this book. I mean, we can see the effects that we as humans are having on the natural environment through greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. I mean, we're seeing an increase in occurrence and severity of natural disasters, and it seems like every week we've got a record high or low temperature, and the list goes on. And scientists have been raising the alarms for decades, but we still find ourselves unable to match the severity of the problem with severe action. And to some degree, for the same obstacles that Carson was up against. You had these big financial and political interests to not change or enact the large-scale regulations or investments to combat the issue. So even though we see the effects of climate change, they aren't as instantaneous as maybe they were in this book, where a plane flies over your house and then you find 20 dead birds in your yard the next day. It's a little easier to keep out of the top of your mind. And I think the inconveniences and costs and the cultural shift required to solve this problem, climate change, are greater than those that were incurred to stop the use of these chemicals. But you're exactly right that the parallel of this book and with climate change now, that's why we're still reading and talking about it today.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point and an observation. In the book, Carson highlights the concept of an ecosystem, which seems pretty obvious today, but wasn't back then. And we've talked a little bit already about ecosystems and their use in fighting pest control. But if we don't properly consider them, we can also have a devastating impact on the ecosystems that are in place in our communities. Every action has a reaction. As a society, we often decide that a plant is in the wrong place at the wrong time and try to improve the place to meet our needs, which goes against what nature decided what was best suited for that place and can have some pretty disastrous impacts on ecosystems and destroying the harmony with them. Carson gives this really great example in the book about sagebrush eradication and making way for cattle grazing. The sagebrush land in the western United States around the Rocky Mountains, that area sees some pretty extremes in climate. And then as that landscape evolved, there was really one plant that was suited for that harsh climate, and that was the sagebrush. Along with the plants, there's two animals that evolved to also fit those harsh conditions, and that was the antelope and the sage grouse. And then despite this, balance of life and the ecosystem that was in place, cattle growers wanted to make it more suitable for their needs. So they sprayed plenty of pesticides, chemicals to destroy all of the sage, to turn it into grazing lands. And what's interesting, she noted that one U.S. Supreme Court justice wrote a book about the wholesale destruction of the landscape in his childhood home of Wyoming. And the United States Forest Service had sprayed 10,000 acres of sage lands there in the Bridger National Forest. It killed the sagebrush, but it also killed the willows that were along the streams. The moose that lived in the willow thickets were killed off, beaver that had made dams, which then created this rich lake area for trout, which is a big tourism aspect in the area. Those were also killed off. So it was a very negative impact that wasn't thought through. And you talked about this. I don't think that we're as quick to act as we were back then, in part because of additional regulations that are in place preventing us from just dropping a mass amount of chemicals on a field one day to stop the problem, and when we're in fact creating a larger problem.
Yeah, our understanding of ecosystems and how delicate they are, it's come a long way, and that's helped us be more cautious. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we don't fall into the same trap. I was just reading about this other category of chemicals. I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but neonicotinoids. It's a chemical that's been linked to the decline of bee and other insect populations. And they've been banned in the European Union and Canada and other countries across the world for a while. But in the United States, we're still having a problem adequately regulating the use of this chemical. I think we banned it a few years ago, but then since they've lessened restrictions, and now I just heard about the EPA is having conversations about maybe extending the use of that chemical for another 15 years. So it's just an example of we'll fall back into the same trap if we're not actively talking about it in the right spheres.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting because you read every day about the impact to the bees and how residents are starting up little colonies in their neighborhood to try and help with the issue, and they can't figure out what's happening to the bees. And ags being really impacted, the agricultural sector, because of the lack of bees, because they'll take whole colonies and move them from field to pollinate, and they don't have enough bees to do this. So it'd be interesting if the EPA follows through on something that's having such an impact already.
Yeah.
Short-term gains in pest control also have some pretty long-term damages and build up in this, year after year in soils. And so acceptable levels one year actually accumulates to some disastrous levels. Most of the book is devoted to pesticides' effects on our natural ecosystems, but there are 4 chapters that detail cases of human pesticide poisoning, cancer, and other illnesses that are attributed to pesticides. There was one story of a spraying campaign that I think you've mentioned in this conversation already that doused an entire town from above. And it goes into detail about this housewife trying to protect her plants is running out there trying to cover them, just getting coated in the chemicals. And I can't imagine a scenario like this playing out today because there'd just be such immediate backlash with something like that.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know how that happened in the first place. It's pretty crazy, but yeah, those chapters were hard to read. There were so many examples of pesticide and herbicide poisoning from farmers and people that use the chemical, but also bystanders that would wander into it. There was an example of a lady who was afraid of spiders And so she purchased DDT at the store and sprayed it in her basement a few times, following the instructions of the bottle and how you're supposed to apply it. And pretty quickly thereafter got leukemia and died. And so it just goes to show that we trust the products that are on the market, and no matter what you put on the labels about warnings of, how dangerous it is, people assume that if it's something they can buy at the store, then it has to be safe enough for them to use. So that we have a great responsibility to make sure that this stuff, that anything that we're allowing to be used is safe, and that we understand the full impacts of it. Another thing I liked from this book is the power of pilot programs and testing interventions incrementally first. That's something we try and do with planning a lot, as it saves money and you make sure you're going to have the right outcome. But Carson gave a good example of, there's a county, I think it was out in the East Coast, where the pollen count was really high for ragweed in the summer. So they just loaded up planes and went and sprayed all the ditches and all the right of way with, I'm not sure, I don't remember which chemical it was, but it had what they intended. It killed all of the ragweed, but like you said, in the sagebrush, it also killed everything else that was in the ditches and in the right of ways. And ragweed does not like competition, and it does really, really well when it doesn't have any competition. So the next year it came back in full force, and they had way more ragweed than they had before because they killed all the competition for the ragweed. And then they got themselves into this problem where now they have to spray with a harsher chemical to try and kill it, or they have to spray every year. And if they had started by maybe trying and testing out spraying a very small portion, they would have been able to see that impact and not get themselves into a worse scenario.
One thing you mentioned about just trusting the bottle and the scenario with the housewife, I was just thinking about this the other day. I walked into my pantry and found that apparently we have a massive ant problem. And so my initial reaction was to go grab the ant spray out of the garage and to kill them as fast as possible and clean the whole pantry out. And then I noticed this like floral pretty smell that when I sprayed it, and I was just like, this is kind of disturbing that a harmful chemical that kills ants is being masked in something that smells more like potpourri. It just made me wonder like how it might lead someone to believe that, oh, this is safe, I can just spray it everywhere, no big deal, and
Absolutely.
Not be too cautious about it. So after reading Silent Spring and having passed the AICP exam, which has this book listed on the recommended reading list, what would you say is one of the more important takeaways from this book that listeners should know?
Yeah, as far as the AICP exam, you will probably be asked what Rachel Carson is known for, what Silent Spring is known for, which of course she was the author, and Silent Spring helped lead to the creation of the EPA and the modern environmental movement. But I think the most important takeaway for us as planners is how critical it is for us to consider the importance of environmental protection in our daily lives and in all the work we do in urban development projects. So, because the decisions that we make have large and lasting impacts on our communities, on public health, and on the natural environment and its ability to last for future generations. So I would challenge you, maybe some action items here. If you haven't heard of the Planners Advocacy Network, I would highly recommend you look that up through the American Planning Association. It's free to sign up, and it's a really good way to stay up to date on how the APA is working to shape both federal and state policy. So the work we do as planners, of course, we try to not let it get too political, even though that's impossible. We try to do that, but there are times where I think we have a responsibility to get involved because we understand the potential impacts. So climate change is one of those where I think we have a responsibility to make sure we're handling and addressing this issue correctly, because it will affect the communities that we live and work in. And another one, kind of unrelated, but related to this book, if you find yourself talking with someone from your public works department or parks or even building maintenance, and maybe if you don't work for a local community, even just the maintenance person for the building you work in, I think it would be interesting to ask them what kinds of integrated pest management practices they use, or if they have any policies, just to see how commonplace it is. I would bet that they could list off some of the things they're doing to align with that, but you never know. You might get an answer where they ask, what is that? And then you have a good little opportunity there to try and educate yourself and educate someone else.
That's a great way to wrap up. And we'll have links in the show notes for some of the topics we discussed and some of the videos we referenced. But I want to say thanks for coming on the podcast today, Cale.
Yeah, thank you so much. Happy Earth Day.